Van Til wants to take it slightly further, and we're not just, wants to take it one step further and actually say that the very structures of our knowledge and the demand, the implicit within this great transcendental argument is that implicit within those very use of reason, and that reason being successful, and the reason why reason is successful, and the reason why reason does give us contact with the real world, it is required. It's a requirement. It's an objective requirement of reality that the Trinity provides a transcendental for making reality understandable in itself. And before, for some people that's spiritual. I don't. That's just religion. That's theology. That's not philosophy. But I think one of the most telling responses, if you like, to that, is that those who have been, those such as Sartre, who really, and the deconstructionists in a sense in our own era, those who really have understood that our discussions, since even through the even if people are thinking about Greek philosophy as the foundation of the West, and of because in a sense people say the Renaissance rediscovered that spirit of Greece and humanism of man being the centre, but those that have really thought about the implications of atheism ended up with a despairing conclusion. And when you think about, say, for example, when you think about sort of like when Huxley and Orwell in their young lives, or once those that really, their socialism and the communist revolution, the Bolshevik revolution, this sort of like this great time of the influence of Marx in that sort of period, and Lenin's interpretation of Marx and his, what he called his correction of Marx, and this great, the very, very quickly, within say 10-20 years, and you see this in work of Sartre as well, is that when people really wanted to work out and wanted to explore, right, what are the implications of the atheistic worldview, those like Sartre in his I mentioned this in a previous video, in his autobiography Words, eventually gets to the point where he says, my whole rationale for my life as a writer, as a communicator, as a playwright, he was a great cultural figure, wasn't he? He said, my whole rationale for my life, what motivated me, I suddenly realised it's totally meaninglessness if I want to work out my atheism consistently, and he said, I don't understand. He said, I write, and I'm going to continue to write, and I'm always going to write, but he said, I used to consider my pen as a sword. Now I just realise I'm just helpless, because in a sense his atheism, the outworking, the final terminus of his atheism is complete meaningless, and nothing means anything. And that's that thought of no for want of a better term, like say meta-narrative or meaning or wider meaning to life or universe, something that reconciles all the different aspects of the human experience. No, everything's just radically contingent, independent experience of life, but that doesn't help you this, it's a fundamental limit. There's nothing that makes sense. There's no reason. There's no rhyme. You just have to come up with your own personal answers to the problems of life. And so, and in Huxley's sort of like example, Huxley and Russell, and these young sort of men who wanted to completely throw off all the restrictions of what was considered Victorian liberal Christian restrictions, and we're just going to be completely free. And Huxley talks about sort of like sexual license. He said we considered this as we wanted life to be meaningless, because that meant that we could be, say, sexually free. And we considered that the societies that we were living in were the results of some sort of Christian understanding of the world, and we wanted to completely jettison the Christian understanding of the world, and that was the period of the humanist manifestos and that. But when you look later in their lives, particularly with Huxley, really interesting, didn't he? He wrote Brave New World, and he said that this great promise of this scientific socialist worldview that was going to create this paradise, and you see this in Orwell's work as well, don't you? The sort of the 1984 and Animal Farm, and you suddenly have this realization of these guys that if we follow out this atheism and this idea that the party is an infallible organ of the dialectic process of history, you end up with this desperately despotic society where the tyranny of the state over the individual is total. And so for those, and in the latter half of the 20th century, as deconstruction really took hold, and it's sort of like this postmodern reaction against the idea that there is anything normative, which stems from the same, it flows out of that same thing. It's this sort of like this basic, if you like, sort of the consequences of atheism, because many of the deconstructionists were consciously trying to jettison anything they felt was of, if you like, a post-Christian baggage from a previous age. The basic assumption of a view of literature that says, well, there is no referent for language, so it's the death of the author. So any reading of the text, even if the author wanted to communicate something to us, but every reading of a text is a misreading, because there's no normative, nothing that you can base and say that there's some intrinsic meaning, which stems just from a basic rejection of there being any rhyme or reason to the universe. And so you have. This is why sort of like the question of what gives us a basis and a grounding for reason and for rational thought. This is why it's a question that needs to be answered, because the consequences of following and saying, right, there is no God, gives us the type of dystopian, dysfunctional, totalitarian society, and we're struggling in the West with this at the moment, aren't we? We're struggling with defining ourselves and defining our culture and what Western society actually means. And we're eating ourselves from within in many ways. We're just calling ourselves imperialists, and and we're destroying and eating ourselves, and what's happening is that the concepts that made the West so powerful, such as freedom and individuality, freedom of speech, those things are being attacked, and instead it's almost like a second coming of communism, where you're getting an elite that then in this sense it's like a technocratic elite. This is what makes it different from the sort of like the previous era, which was far more scientific. It was meant to be scientific, scientific socialism, you know, and far more, in a sense, economic theory and you saw the Marxist analysis of the relationships between the producers of wealth and the bourgeois class and the factory owners. You know, it's far more our modern technocratic dimension is the idea of that there are sort of an expert class that are now have all the tools of modern technology, which then allow them to manage society in that will create a new sort of technological utopia. Where every aspect of your life is known and controlled for the benefit of all. So it's very much more of a second coming of communism. So that's why, in a sense, the ability to anchor your wider conception of knowledge and what makes knowledge necessary and possible in, say, a transcendent trinity that's not just abstract but is real, and we deal with that is of such fundamental importance. It might not seem on the surface to be very fundamentally important, but if you jettison the concept of God from the public square, I'm talking about, when I say public square, I'm talking about the intellectual conversation that we have as a culture, you then end up with those that consider themselves to be God. They take on the attributes of godhood, and they consider themselves to have no limitations whatsoever to their own power. And in our age, there would be those who would call themselves sort of transhumanists, and who believe, that we're evolving to be one with machines, and they have no, because there's no constraints on them. That there's no, they don't consider people to have, say, for example, natural rights. In the American Constitution, it's formally stated, that our rights aren't granted by any government or any means of man. They are granted to us by God. So you can immediately see that if you and those rights are then considered, because they come from God, those rights are considered immutable, which basically means nobody can take away a right that God gives you. But if there is no God, and if your rights don't come from God, but they come from the government, then the government giveth and the government taketh away. And so the government then becomes the arbitrator. So you can see how important this, how philosophically, how important our philosophical beliefs regarding the role that God plays in our knowledge and plays in that it's not something that's abstract, but it's something absolutely essential to our how it works out ethically and politically in our life. So if I'm going to try and land from going into orbit from the transcendental argument, what's so powerful about it is that it demonstrates how that the Christian conception of God is objectively necessary if we are going to make sense of reason, rationality, causality, any of of logic, grounding of logic. It all is a prerequisite for intelligibility of life at all, and that is, that's the argument I work through in my thesis, is putting the meat on all those different bones. So I hope this is, it's very different than the presentation that I was envisaging a couple of hours ago, but I think it really sort of, it's much more sort of like saying, that could be really interesting to investigate that, and I hope that it's my earnest sort of like hope that just because I start talking about God, that you suddenly think, oh, it's theology rather than philosophy, because it's not. That's the thing. The concept of God, and if you like, what are the limitations of, what can philosophy tell us that's necessary about God, or is God necessary? They're philosophical questions as well, and we don't want to prejudge those questions, like a naturalist would, for example, and just say, yep, no, we're not going to, we're just going to explain things in terms of what we hear from nature. So you're then just describing rather than explaining, I would say. And that's the distinction. If you want to explain and to give an account of why we have nature, you're always going to get into these questions which well, God's going to turn up. You can't get, it doesn't matter if you read any sort of like other scientific biographies, and there's even written by guys who are atheists. I think there was Michael Gribbin and his. He wrote one about Einstein, another one about Hawkins, and they have to deal with the God question, even though he wants to say, oh well, he's an atheist, and they dismissed God from their thinking and didn't. And if you're careful, you do careful study of Hawkins, he actually talks about that in some of his work, and he actually said, well, I didn't want to talk about that because people then think that I'm that I've got this simplistic view of God, and that I'm instantly setting myself in opposition to science or something. It was far more nuanced in his in his own words. He's saying it's far away. He's saying, no, I'm not an atheist. I don't not believe in God. Whereas you read some of these biographers of Hawkins, and they were saying, he moved from atheism, he'd moved from sort of just from agnosticism into atheism, and that was, that's the common cultural conception of him, wasn't it? And same with Einstein. There's some remarkable accounts of those who were involved with Einstein in the latter years of his life, and I think it might have been his nurse, and there was apparently they're having this discussion where she might have said something. She'd seen God at work in the world, and Einstein had apparently said to her, yes, I've been look, what was the, well, I wish I could remember the quote. I think it said something like, yes, I've been watching him at work in the world too. And so, these even though these guys in some ways were very, pioneers of a new physics, pioneers of a new way of understanding the world, they hated religious dogmatism, and that was very much true. That's undeniable, I think. Einstein was, had been in communication with Carnap, and Carnap was really they had a lot of the local logical positive guys were Jewish, and they'd had to leave Austria and the Vienna Circle, and they ended up in the US, and Carnap in particular made a point of working on Sunday because it was a religious day. They rejected this sort of like, so this whole milieu that they were in, was very anti-dogmatic and very anti-clericalist. But that is very much distinct from saying that these people were atheists. They and the role that say that a concept of God was not. They weren't rejecting the concept of God per se, but they some of them were very vocal in their rejection of a dogmatic, what for want of a better term, say sort of like of that primitive fundamentalist sort of circular obscurantist oversimple characterization of reality. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, that Christian philosophers are required is to be far more intellectually robust and understanding and knowledgeable. You know, that's why I want to encourage people who are believers to be involved at a non-trivial level. But I also hope that as I give these talks, as I talk about these issues, that it's not, that, you know, these are not things which I'm not wanting to exclude people who are just thinking out there, because I wasn't, you know, I didn't grow up a Christian or in a Christian sort of like home, but I do believe that the Christian worldview is the most valuable worldview that the world has ever seen. I think there are some there's some amazing studies which I will dig out where, you know, I think what it's called sort of how Christianity changed the world or something, and the Christian sort of like concept of how it influenced so much of our what became Western values, and what became values that not just were in the West but became values that permeated other societies as well and had such a positive impact on the world. You know, Christianity as a cultural force, not just a theological force and a spiritual understanding of you know what people tend to think of as spiritual Christianity, as a spiritual enterprise. But these were things of how much greater the cultural impact was. There is one, I think that was when he was in the University of Chicago, I think a very famous one, that say how Christianity changed the world. I think it was a very comprehensive study. There are some simpler ones, I think, which I think seem to me like they've been derived from his overall argument. I'm not sure what they offer as what that would be new there. But it's of such central importance to our understanding our place in the world, and understanding how significant what the Christian scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures and what they give society and culture is. So, you know, that's my earnest, heartfelt desire and prayer, is that it's this, you know, my work, the references which I have, the argument I trace, would be helpful to anyone at whatever place of belief, and that it's useful to follow the argument that I make, in order to just be those that know what we're talking about. Okay, so, well, yes, I managed to do something very, very different than what I originally was thinking about, because I was just going to look a bit more at transcendental arguments and in more spiritual, but I think at least I've sort of managed to get that bit at the beginning of this is what a transcendental argument is, the reductio ad absurdum, and dealing, you know, to demonstrate, yes, it's a legitimate form. Other very, you know, philosophers outside the sort of like the Christian worldview have used transcendental arguments, have made extensive use of transcendental arguments, and have argued and established things about the physical world, you know, as arguments for the basic character of how do our mind and world link together, have used transcendental arguments. So it, as a legitimate argument form, I believe that, you know, if nothing else, I wanted to say, right, it's a legitimate argument form. Now, the individual transcendental arguments, examples of them, when we thought about Strawson's view, you know, arguing for the continuing, you know, the particular identity, that if anybody wants to, during time, you know, can, even when you're not looking at something, that is actually a really important sort of argument, isn't it, to have, and to demonstrate that anybody that tries to argue that there's no way you can say that objects do persist through time unless you're looking at them. His point was that you have to assume that concept to argue against that concept. He said it's inescapable. Your basic fundamental commitments, you cannot get outside of that, and so that's the power of the transcendental argument. Just as Aristotle would, the if you like, the first example of what we see as explicit transcendental argumentation in the history of philosophy, where he's saying that you can't get outside of logic if you want to argue about logic. And so that's the power of the transcendental argument. That's the essence of the transcendental argument. I think the technical disputes about the transcendental argument, they're probably best either I would have to go through those in a lecture format with screenshots and PowerPoints and because Stroud objected to the transcendental argument, but that's because Stroud's point was that transcendental arguments will only get you to conceptual necessity, and what we're actually saying is that we believe that we can get beyond when Davidson came with his because Stroud, sorry, I'm getting my words a little bit mixed up here. So the distinction between the conceptual transcendental argument and the ontological transcendental argument of saying the world is, the discussion was that Stroud's criticism of Strawson's transcendental argument was the most that a transcendental argument can give us is conceptual necessity. We have to think about that. We might have to think about the world being in a particular way, and in that sense you can demonstrate the reasonableness of belief in God, but you could never get to an argument can never show you that God must necessarily exist, or if anything, just put something in place of God. Any concept must be necessary. A transcendental argument might be able to show that it's conceptually necessary for us to accept this X, but that doesn't mean that the world really is the way that it is. Whereas we then sort of described Davidson's, the Donald Davidson with his very, very, very famous paper that really moved the argument, I think, on. He wasn't, necessarily thinking about things in a transcendental fashion, but the transcendental implications of his argument when he said that if you can recognize something as a conceptual scheme, then he's basically saying that we can only recognize things as conceptual schemes if they are already part of our conceptual scheme. It's not like there's all these competing conceptual schemes out there. He was actually saying, and the implications, the transcendental implications of that, was saying that instead of you needing an additional, Stroud's initial criticism of Strawson was that you need this metaphysical bridge of the verification principle to get you to the real world, because there's no necessary link between our concepts and the way the world really is. Whereas the use that was made of Davidson in saying, well, actually, if we recognize anything as conceptually necessary, then the world, from the point of view of our, you can then make that link to but we must understand the world as being that way as well. We could not understand the world in any different way. We then have to take a step back from that and say, well, that seems to show that the conceptual transcendental argument can actually say that the world really is the way that it is. We then have to take a step back from that as believers to actually understand, yes, but Davidson's point really is an epistemological point only. It's to do with our theory of knowledge. The more, when you look at Davidson's argument, you're saying that yes, we could never recognize something has a conceptual scheme different from our own. We would never be able to recognize it, but that there is a difference, an important difference. That doesn't mean that there aren't other conceptual schemes. And for us as believers, we would have to say, yes, we know, because the Lord explicitly says, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, and my ways are higher than your ways. So there are different conceptual schemes out there. God does think differently than us.